what lenses should I buy? And there are many choices. There's 9 there. I've got some others in the other room. Got a nice little set. These aren't all mine, I must tell you. I've borrowed quite a few of these. I'm doing some other videos on these specific lenses, but anyway, I'll talk about these a little bit later on. So, but really, it's what lenses do I buy, and I do have some thoughts on that. So what I propose to do this evening is to go through why different lenses are necessary and what is it about the different lenses that affects the look of your photograph. Wide angle lenses, telephoto lenses, standard lenses, and what does that even mean? So that's the theme for this evening, and hopefully we'll be able to do that in about an hour. I've got a few photographs to show, which you've seen quite a few of already on that little rolling slideshow. So I should really just kick off with the flicking to my iPad here. So I'm down in the corner here. And this topic is, of course, lenses. Ever seen one of those before, anybody? This is actually a picture taken at the old Leica factory in Solms before they moved to Wetzlar. This is a one-off lens that was made for a Middle Eastern gentleman to photograph birds, we believe. There was only one made. There's one in existence and one prototype, which is this one. And I believe it was made in 2006. It was the last of the R series lenses ever made, and it cost about $2 million. It's a 1600 f5.6 Apo Telit R lens. But what does that mean? What does the 1600 millimeters mean, and what does the f5.6 mean? Well, it's quite simple. All lenses have 2 very important characteristics. One of those is the focal length, and the other is the maximum aperture, the widest aperture to which the lens can be opened so that it lets the most light in. So this is a 1600 millimeter, which is very, very long, and the widest aperture you can use is f5.6. And you'll see all lenses have that characteristic, that allows you to classify them in various ways. Yeah, pretty impressive lens. I've seen this in person, and if you stick your head into the actual lens hood, which is about that wide, you can actually hear an echo when you speak inside it. So it's pretty impressive. Anyway, a little bit of a starting point just to warm everybody up. There are a lot of lenses. That says historical. I got my head in the way. 7 lenses in the CL system, 9 lenses in the SL system, 22 lenses in the current range of M lenses, because a few have dropped off the radar recently. But overall, over 140 M lenses were made over the years, going back to, well, 1914, I suppose, with the original Leica. So there's a lot to choose from. But again, they all have that characteristic of focal length and maximum aperture, and that's what gives you the ability to choose which lens you want to use. All right, so on the front of all lenses, you will see those numbers and a description. Now, this obviously is, I'm going to use Leica lenses all evening. This applies to all brands, all lenses ever made. Sometimes it's hard to see this information, but it will be there somewhere. But on the Leica ones, it's always written on the front of the lens, and it'll have the name of the lens, in this case, an Apo Summicron M, and then it'll be 1:2, 1:2 ratio. That means it's an f2 maximum aperture lens, because it's the ratio of the focal length to the aperture physical size. If you remember in the talk I did about apertures, so it's a ratio of 1:2, therefore it's f2, and the focal length is 50. And then the aspheric, that means the asp means aspheric, which means there are aspheric elements included in that lens. And an aspheric element basically means that the face of the lens is not the part of a sphere. It's the actual radius, or the curvature of that face of that lens varies across its actual surface, and that allows for more accurate correction of color and focus, so that we can design out the inherent aberrations in lenses. It's very tricky to make. That's why they're expensive. So the aspheric lenses are generally better than non-aspheric lenses, but that's not definitely set in stone, because some of the classic lenses, like, I'll show you this one in a minute, you probably can't see because it's really tiny, but if I can hold it up there, that's the little Summicron 28 f5.6. No aspheric elements in that, as far as I'm aware. Nope, just looking at it there. I'll come back to that one in a sec. So that's the information that the lens tells you. The important thing, and this is something that you need to remember, is that the focal length of the lens relates to the angle of view of the lens. So basically what you see in the viewfinder. And regardless of the sort of camera you're using, the lower the number, the wider the angle that you will be seeing through your viewfinder, which is fixed in terms of a frame. There's a limit to that frame, and what fits into that frame, what you can see through that frame, is determined by the focal length of the lens. Wide angle lenses are generally less than 50 millimeter in focal length, and we're talking about Leica SL, SL2, so-called full frame cameras here, and I'll come back to that point in a sec. So this is a 24 millimeter lens, and it has an angle of view of 84 degrees, and this is the sort of thing you would see through that lens. This is Sydney Harbour from a helicopter. The reason I put that in there is because I've got another picture coming up which was taken with a 90 millimeter lens, because I was using the zoom lens on the SL, the 24 to 90 millimeter. So that's a 24 mil angle of view. Then you've got, let's say, a 90 millimeter lens which has a 25 degree angle of view. Less angle of view gives it this magnified look. And we'll be talking a little bit more about perspective in a sec, but can you see how that's foreshortened? But they were both taken from exactly the same place. I was in a helicopter hovering over the heads, so I could frame it differently with the different focal lengths of the zoom. There you go. There's the 24 to 90 zoom, which is the sort of the standard lens, if you like, for the SL2 and the SL2S. And if you look in the left-hand side, you'll see there's a little red box, and that is the 90 mil framing. And then there's the 90 mil shot on the right. So you can see there's an enormous variation between the two. And in fact, you can call that almost a 4:1 zoom ratio, give or take a little bit, 3.5:1, because 24 times 4 is, what's that, 96. So 24 to 90 is 4:1. So you've got a quarter of the width of the frame in that zoomed in shot compared to the 24 millimeter. So you can think in those geometrical terms if you like, but the important thing to remember is that the wide angle lenses are low numbers, 18, 21, 28, 20, 24, 28, 35, and so on. The telephoto lenses are above that 50 millimeter point, and they tend to bring things towards you, and we'll definitely be talking about the different looks of those lenses in a sec. Okay, we just need to address this thing, this misconception, myth. There's a lot of misinformation about crop sensors, so-called crop sensors. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I just wanted to throw this diagram at you and another one in a sec. If you are using a lens of the same focal length and you're standing the same position, photographing the same thing, a smaller sensor will simply capture a smaller part of that image. Therefore, your angle of view will be slightly less, which will give it the impression of it being a slightly longer focal length lens. And if you look at this diagram, everything is the same except the sensor is smaller. And this is the difference between the SL2S, the SL2, and the M10, and the CL, which is an APS-C sized sensor. And the APS-C size sensor is, let me see, if I read my notes here, it's written on there, 16 by 24 millimeters, whereas the full frame camera is 24 by 36 millimeters. And the 35 millimeter full frame, 36 by 24 millimeter dimension, originates from the original Leica, which was designed by Barnack in 1914 and used 35 millimeter movie film. And when you turn the film through 90 degrees to get a slightly bigger negative area, it had to be 36 by 24 millimeters. And that number, those two numbers have stuck with camera designs ever since 1914 and have influenced cameras ever since. So everything seems to be related to that. And when people talk in terms of 35 millimeter equivalent, what they're talking about is the focal length of that lens converted to 35mm full frame format to give you an impression of its angle of view. And in this particular case, for instance, a 35mm lens on the CL, which you would consider to be a wide-ish angle lens on the SL2, but on the CL, same focal length gives you a standard lens, which is what this picture was taken with. So there's that little conversion factor which confuses people. And you will see on, for instance, the CL lenses, it's a different range of focal lengths, like an 18 to 56 zoom. It helps some people to convert that into full frame terms to get an idea that that's effectively a 28 to 70 zoom. Doesn't really matter how you get there. The idea is it's slightly wide to slightly telephoto. Anyway, enough said about crop sensors, because it does mess with your head because it changes the depth of field and so on. But that's just a very, very brief summary of the whole thing. Question from Ludwig, which Owen has answered. Could you please explain APO? I have here I'll just come up so you can see me. This is the new 35mm apochromatic Summicron APO. There's only a couple of these in the range. There's the APO 50mm Summicron as well. And these are generally, as Owen correctly answers, they are highly corrected for color fringing, and they are called apochromatic, so that there's no possibility of color fringing. They are generally a higher quality. Well, I say generally, they are absolutely of a higher quality. And I only got this the other day to shoot some test images with it. Oh my goodness. The edge sharpness of this lens is astonishing, because if the colors don't quite, whoops, don't want to break it, it's not mine. If the colors don't focus at precisely the same point, it just softens the image slightly, even though you don't see color fringing. But when you correct for it totally, then all the focal lengths of lens focus at precisely the same amount, and you get this extra sharpness, which is quite remarkable. I wasn't convinced for a while until I started testing it, and then it just suddenly dawned on me when you look really closely just how incredibly sharp those lenses are. Anyway, that's what APO is all about. Okay, so let's go through the different types of lenses. I'm using super wide for the 18 and the 21. Now, I don't have my 18 here, it's on the camera. And unfortunately, Leica discontinued the 18mm recently, because it's the first M lens I ever bought, and I've shot, I think, somewhere in the region of 20,000 photographs with it over the years, something like that, possibly more. It's one of my go-to lenses. Now, you would need the 21mm lens, and I've got one of them here. I'll bring that up in a sec. Thing about super wides is they work in really confined spaces. They're great inside, and you get a really interesting perspective, which we will talk about in a sec. You can include a lot of subject, and if you use them correctly, you don't get what people would call distortion. You get an exaggeration of perspective because it's taking, well, it's about 90 degrees. Don't quote me on this. It's somewhere around 90 degrees, maybe 95 degrees of subject, and it's folded, if you like, optically into your viewfinder, so you get this extra width. And I find it an astonishingly useful lens for so many things beyond what you might imagine. You might think of it as being a fairly specialist lens, but I use it so much that I never go anywhere without it. These sorts of shots don't look like they're shot with super wide lenses because of the subject matter. I mean, there's no straight lines in nature, they say. It's not strictly true, but in this particular park, which I believe is Butchart Gardens in Canada, went there a few years ago. And it allows you to bring in so much subject without focusing on one thing, which is a double-edged sword. So super wide angle lenses are often quite hard to use because you've got so much in the viewfinder that it's hard to organize. So again, sometimes you've got to go closer and you've got to try and simplify that picture like you would normally do with good composition. So they can be a little bit tricky to use. Gary Gordon asks, is it true that the 50mm Summelex 1.4 is an Apo design? I read from Torsten Overgaard that the designer said he used an Apo design. Well, yes. Peter Carver has been quoted in an interview as saying that the 50mm Summilux aspheric, which don't have one here, does incorporate an apochromatic element in the design. Whether it's apochromatic design or there's one element, I'm not exactly sure. It's not publicly discussed. He was indiscreet saying that. I honestly don't know. But yes, I have seen that reported, and I can't verify the truth of it. You'd have to ask Peter Carver himself. But if he said it in an interview, I'm sure it's true. It may be that they were just trying some different designs and they incorporated that, but it's not listed as an Apo Summilux. That's I should imagine it's very hard to do that because the design for the faster lenses gets harder and harder, and to make it apochromatic as well would be even more challenging. But my knowledge limit on lens design has been reached every time I talk to Peter Carver. He's an astonishing talent, he really is. So yes, I can't answer that question, Gary, in great detail. This was shot on the 21 millimeter, and I think I used the 21 1.4, which I happen to have here in my hand. This is an astonishing lens. It's quite bulky, but it's actually a super wide and a fast lens as well. But this picture does not look like it was shot with a super wide lens. I hope you agree. That's because I'm quite close and there's nothing to give it away. There's only two strong elements in that picture. And with the lenses being nice and rectilinear, so they don't curve much at all, they give you straight lines, you really wouldn't think that that was taken in that way. It looks to me more like a 35mm shot. And the fact of it is I couldn't get any further away. This is taken in a very, very narrow doorway on the entrance to one of those rock-hewn caves in Lalibela in Ethiopia. And the only way I could get the framing I wanted was to shoot with a super wide lens, in this case a 21. And again, you shouldn't get locked into this thinking that super wide lenses always look like super. With the 21 1.4, the 21 Semilex, with the 21 1.4, the 21 Semilex, you can also get this very interesting effect of a very wide angle lens, but also very limited depth of field. This, and it's not the greatest photograph. I'm not put that in there as one of my most successful photographs. I actually shot this on a workshop in South Australia quite a few years ago. But I found this and I thought I'm going to throw it in because it shows you a very interesting look, which is a mixture of wide angle and limited depth of field, which you don't see very often. Wide angle shots generally have more depth of field by the nature of wide angle lenses. But when you can open it up to 1.4 and get close to your subject, you can still have that interesting three-dimensionality about it. So if I show this to people and say, what lens? They usually say 35mm, 35 1.4, they say. And when I say it's a 21 1.4, they go, no way. But anyway, take my word for it, it absolutely is. So again, don't be locked into this mindset of super wides give you a particular look, because used in different ways, they can be quite superb. This I shot last night, literally last night. I'm doing a series of videos for our YouTube channel on the different focal lengths. The 50mm lens one's already there. The next one I think will be 35, then 28 and 21. So I was just needing to do some test images and some sample images, and just popped down to the Story Bridge in Brisbane last night to see if we got anything nice with the light. But you know, it's okay, it's not too bad. But that's again 21mm. That's the 21mm Elmar, which is, or Super Elmar, which is one of these down here. I've got it here. That's the, I say budget version. It's not the exotic 21 1.4. It's only tiny, but it's a phenomenally sharp little lens. And if you are in the market for wide angle lenses, and I'll be talking about lens sets at the end, the 21 should be on your list of potential lenses. All right. Now, Leica don't make a 24 anymore, unfortunately, except in the sense of the SL lenses, so the 24 to 90 particularly. And there is a 24mm Summicron due out soon, I would imagine. It's on the roadmap. It was publicized last year as being on the roadmap, a 21 and a 24 and a 21 for the SL. I don't know when they're going to be actually released. I don't have that information, but I'm looking forward to seeing that, because I think 24 is a really nice focal length. It's a little bit wider than the 28. It's not quite as wide as a 21, obviously. I find it less extreme and extremely useful. And the reason I put this shot in is to show you how, when you get into the wide angle realm, 28 and beyond or wider, you start to get this geometric effect of parallel lines converging at a vanishing point. You see, if you extended those green lines, they would all point precisely to the horizon. And you can use this effect to focus attention on your subject. I do it all the time. If you're getting close with wide angle lenses, you can usually find something which has parallel lines, like on the ground or something, particularly shadows. Like if you're photographing into the sun and the subject has, the shadow is between you and the subject, so it's casting its shadow towards you, you get this fabulous effect of anything that's casting a shadow leading you back to the subject that's casting the shadow. It's very, very powerful effect, and something that only really works with the wider lenses, particularly the 24, 21 and the 18 in my case. Now the 28mm lenses are an interesting focal length. Some people find them to be a bit of a nothing focal length. They're neither wide nor are they, really useful. Personally, I think it's almost the perfect street lens. That's, again, personally. Some people say for street 50mm, very hard to shoot street on a 50mm. I mean, a lot of people do, and with great success, but it's very difficult. 35 is probably the classic street lens, and we'll come to 35s in a sec. 28 means you can get a bit more in and get a bit closer, but it makes it harder to organize the shot. So, and there's a very good reason that the Q has a 28mm lens, and it's precisely for that reason, is it really is useful. You could always crop it if you are a little loose on your framing, because remember, you can't uncrop a normal lens, but you can crop a slightly wide lens. So shoot generously and crop out the bit you want, gives you options. This is the ballroom dancing they do in Fuxing in China, in the park, and it's Fuxing Park in Shanghai in China, and it's quite a thing to see. It really is. And the 28mm lens allowed me to get quite close in, and I really like getting close in with my street and reportage pictures because it makes you feel more involved. It's a little more confronting sometimes because obviously when you're closer, you obviously have people see what you're doing, but there's ways of working around that. But it also has a nice fall off of perspective so that you've got a sense of dimension, because the near subjects are enlarged slightly and the further subjects are reduced, and you've got a very clear reduction of size into the distance, which gives you that three-dimensionality. And that's perspective. With the 18 or the 21, it would have been too messy. I would have had too many cars, too many other people. The 28 was about perfect in my estimation. Same with this one from Ethiopia. It doesn't look like a 28mm lens. This was shot on the 28 Summilux. So it's shot at f1.4, and that's why the background is nicely out of focus. So again, you've got the wide angle lens effect, but you've still got the limited depth of field. And I found that perspective exaggeration with the rifle over his shoulder, it worked really nicely. It also reduces the size of the people in the distance and makes him look more powerful in the foreground. So again, 28mm lens worked really well there. Just threw this one in as a bit of a throwaway picture, really. This is, I think, one of the tunnels under Singapore. I can't exactly, it's an old shot. I shot on my original M9 years ago, but on a 28mm lens, handheld, don't know what the shutter speed was, probably 1 second or something in the dark. And I got an image that I quite like. But again, that wide angle lens, 28, not too wide, just gives me the right focal length for these sort of slightly abstract pictures. You can make out the rails of the train that the train are running on there. And the last 28mm shot, this is a trip I did to China about 6-7 years ago, and it does allow you to collect in more subject than a 50mm or a 35mm lens and get a little bit closer without distorting the perspective. I just enjoyed this picture for the colors. It's quite astonishing, the range of colors you see in these Tibetan temples. This was up in Qinghai province, up in the Tibetan plateau. And again, 28mm lens just allowed me to organize that picture nicely. I could have shot this on a Q, of course, but that was before the Q came out. All right, 35mm lens. This is the staple, if you like, of many Leica M photographers. I believe that the 35mm lens is the biggest selling lens of all time for Leica, the focal length. I think the first one came out in 1930, if I'm not mistaken, and it's outsold every other focal length of lens collectively, not an individual lens, but collectively the 35mm lenses are very, very popular. I'm not sure why. I'd be interested in the comments to see who uses a 35 or a 50, because they're the two lenses that most people start with. Personally, and again, this is just me, You will have your own opinions, and that's completely fine. I find the 35mm a little nothing. It's neither wide angle nor is it a standard lens. It's in that middle, but other people find it extremely useful because they can just include a bit more. The perspective technically is not natural like a 50mm lens would be, but somehow it is natural. It's very hard to put your finger on it. The angle of view is kind of like your awareness, your main awareness area. Obviously, your actual awareness is more like 120 degrees, but the 35mm lens seems to encompass what you're mostly aware of. Again, I could waffle about that for ages. You either like it or you don't. Vincent says he's got a 35 and a 50. Well, that is interesting because I don't want to preempt my last few slides, but one piece of advice I've often given to people is don't buy both. Unless one of them is one of the exotics, maybe, because a 50 and a 35 are so close together that you'd be better off with different focal lengths. I'll come back to that point in a short while. But then you might want a 35 Summicron, and you might have a 50mm Noctilux for different reasons, and that's completely fine, of course. But they are so close together. Older shot from Berlin. This is the 28mm Summicron, which I used a lot when I first got my M9. This is the Holocaust Memorial. And again, it gives you that opportunity to work with perspective and converging lines, exaggerate the perspective a little bit, but not so much. Because again, with a 24 or 28, a 21mm lens, I would have inevitably included stuff that I didn't want. And if I showed you another shot, you would see, if I can move my mouse into the screen somewhere, where is it? No, I can't do that on this. I'm on the iPad. Oh, hang on, I can do that. Here we go. If I was to show you what's up here, what's out of frame at the top is the street with cars and the edge of the whole memorial. There's one person there who I couldn't get rid of. What I wanted was the single figure standing or walking contemplatively through the memorial. But by using the 35mm lens, I have managed to just isolate what I wanted, but still include the scale and the geometry. The 50mm lens would have weakened it a little bit, because if you imagine that cropped to 50mm size, you just wouldn't get as many of the big stone blocks in. So 35 was perfect for this shot. John Mamatil says, although I have many 35mm lenses, my fave still remains the Q28. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, John has a collection of lenses to die for. This was just a walkabout lens, 35mm walkabout lens. I was doing some test shots up near, where is this? This would be, I think, Moreton Island, Stradbroke Island, one of the beaches there, just going for a walk in the evening, and some nice light came through. And the 35mm lens is probably the sort of lens you throw on the camera when you don't want to take any other lenses, because it's probably more versatile than a 50mm lens. But maybe I don't know. Up to you. Okay, 50mm lenses. These give you a natural perspective. So everything in the shot looks to be about the same distance away in the image as it is in real life. I think technically standard lens is somewhere around 54mm or something. You'd have to do the maths, but over the years, right the way back to the beginning of photographic history, the 50mm lens on the Leica set the pace, and everybody does 50mm lenses. Every single manufacturer always has, always will. It allows you to take a shot with no geometrical inflection or effect. And Henri Cartier-Bresson made the point that he didn't want his lens to have an effect. He wanted it to be as he saw it. He did use 35mm lenses occasionally, and I'm sure others, but the idea of the 50mm lens was that it didn't bring any geometrical or perspective change to what he saw. Everything in the shot was where he saw it in relation, and that was important. And that's fine if you want to go down that path. Personally, I just found it a very effective lens for simple things like portraits, because shooting the 50mm Summilux f1.4 wide open, as you should do, gives you that nice fall off of focus, gives it a slightly telephoto effect, but you don't have to stand further away, and you can still pick your background nicely. Yes, you can shoot this with a 75 or a 90, but then you've got to physically stand further away, and that's not always possible. So you've got that option. I just found that a very nice perspective with a 50mm. Then you've got the more exotic lenses like the 50mm Noctilux, the f0.95. When you focus on something very close to the lens, the background is so out of focus, it's not funny. But you can use that to really draw attention to a subject. In this case, it's a spearhead held by this gentleman up in the Kimberley. And because faces are great attractors of your eye in a shot, you want to look at the face. If you blur it substantially, it doesn't compete with the actual subject. If they were both equally sharp, or if the face was a lot less blurred, your eye would be drawn way too much to the face and not the subject. So it's a really good way of separating out subjects. Obviously, there's a limit to how far you can do that because you can still recognize his face, but I find that very useful. If you did that with a 35mm Similux or a 28mm Similux, you would have a very, very exaggerated perspective. His head would be a lot further away and smaller, and it would start to look a bit weird. But again, this is all about composition and geometry, and we'll be talking a bit more about that in a sec. Then once you go past 50mm, you end up in the short telephoto range, and that would be in the Leica range, the 75 and the 90. There's two of each. There's a 75 aposummicron and a 90 aposummicron, and then there's the 75 Noctilux and the 90 Summilux, which are considerably more exotic and phenomenal. This was taken on the 90mm Summicron SL, on the SL, and I don't own one of these. If I was in the market for another lens, I'd probably buy this one because it's just perfect for this sort of shot. It allows you to isolate the subject. It doesn't mean that it means that you don't have to go too close, which obviously isn't always ideal, and it gives a slight flattening on the perspective, which is quite flattering to subjects, particularly for head and shoulder portraits. But one thing about it, as your angle of view narrows, it means that behind your subject, you're getting less and less of the background. This is why wide-angle lenses are so hard to work with sometimes, because you've got behind the subject, you've got to infinity, let's say, and it includes so much stuff. It's very, very hard to isolate your subject from any background. As soon as you go to telephoto, because your angle of view is a lot more restricted, you're only really looking through a little pillbox, a little narrow slot at whatever's behind the subject. And that means that if you move yourself a very short distance, you can completely change the background. Whereas the wide angle lens, if you move the same distance, just a couple of feet, you're not going to change the background at all. You'll change the relationship of various subjects, but not the background fundamentally. But with a 90mm lens, you've only got to move a few feet and you could choose a completely different background, which is very, very powerful. The other thing about telephoto lenses is the compression of perspective, which is really important. We'll talk a bit more in a sec because I've got some slides on this subject. But whilst wide-angle lenses exaggerate close objects and diminish distant objects, the telephoto does the opposite. It tends to bring the background closer, and it evens out the relationship between subject and background so they look a similar size, and you can use that to great effect with certain subjects. In this case, using a wide-angle lens, the pillars on the left get very diluted to the left-hand side of the frame because you're more or less looking out at 90 degrees. But when you use a 90mm lens, you're only looking at the columns as they overlap, and it gives that much stronger geometrical regression to the point, and the point is more or less where the figure is. So you can compress that background and it changes things dramatically. So very, very powerful. There's another kind of shot which I always like shooting, and that is the two-up portrait where you've got one person sharp and one person out of focus. You can do this with a 50mm lens. You can do it with a 35mm lens, but you've got to be very close. But with a 90mm lens, it's really easy. So I can focus on the child's face with the amazing paint, and her mother in the background is there as a supporting figure, but she's clearly not the subject of the photograph. So it enables you to do that two-up portrait, but only one is sharp. Again, 90mm Summicron on the SL, and of course shot at f2. I shoot most of my pictures on that lens at f2 because it's designed that way. but that's a very powerful technique. Gary Gordon says, I love my old 1937 35mm Elmar. Absolutely. I think I might have one of those. Is that the one that pulls out, the collapsing one? I can't remember. But yeah, the older lenses can be really effective. All right, then we get to the super telephoto. So super telephoto, I'm thinking is 200 plus. And now Leica does make a 135 f4, which I don't think we stock in Australia, but we can get to special order. It's a very hard lens to focus unless you use the visor flex on the M. On the SL, it's very easy, but if you're going to use the SL, you probably go with a 90 to 280 zoom, which this was taken on. Super telephoto lenses, 280 mils, that's effectively a 6 times magnification, 5.5 times magnification. So if something looks 1 meter away in the shot, you were 5 meters away or 6 meters away when you took it. And this is a Chelada monkey from Ethiopia, and they are pretty docile, but when he bares his teeth, you really, really wouldn't want to get them sunk into you. So it's wise to be a little discreet when you're photographing wild animals. It also allows you to really get tight in on the subject and eliminate all backgrounds. So there's a lot to be said for very powerful telephoto lenses, particularly when it comes to photographing these guys. This is up in Mount Borrowdale, which is a Kakadu type place up in Arnhem Land. It's like a Kakadu on steroids. It's a smaller area, but much more densely packed with wildlife and rock art. And you can go there and do custom trips. And I was out in one of the tinnies with the guide, and we were able to drift fairly close. I mean, I'm only probably 3 or 4 meters from this croc, but by getting really tight in, I could just get the eye sharp, and that really makes the picture, that yellow eye looking out of the blue water. Impossible shot with a wide angle lens. Even if you did get that close, which wouldn't be very wise, you wouldn't get that perspective and that real sense of scale. The other thing you get with the longer lenses is, again, this compression of perspective. It's great for distant subjects, but when you've got the little figure in the distant landscape scene, then you really start to get a very, very different look to normal lenses. So this is something that I do a lot with the telephoto lenses, very, very powerful. And then the classic use of long lenses is when you've got dust. And you simply do not get this effect when you're using standard or wide angle lenses. It just gets diluted. When you can stand back quite a long way and get tight in to something that's backlit and dusty, it massively enhances the effect of the dust. So it's one of my little tricks, if you like, is if you've got a dusty evening and people are moving around like this is in India somewhere, and the rodeo pictures that I've been taking, the telephoto lens into the sun will always make it look more dusty, and it will really exaggerate the effect. So very, very powerful. All right, hopefully we're still going okay. I'm just looking at the comments, just hoping that someone's going, hey, you've disappeared again. Okay, perspective. Now this is really important. The wide angle lenses exaggerate receding things. They bring close objects forward and push back distant objects. And what that does is tends to exaggerate converging parallel lines. And this shot from the Taj Mahal is a great example. This is on the 18mm shot on the M240. And you can see incredibly clearly those receding lines, and they just take your eye past the figure sitting on the left straight to the mysterious form of the Taj itself in the fog, and you can just about make out the sun next to the Taj on the right there. This was actually an image I won an award for in the AIPP APAS, and it's one of my favorite pictures. I was really quite pleased with it. It's the geometry that makes it so strong, and without those converging lines, it just wouldn't be as powerful. Shoot this on a 50mm lens, you simply can't frame it like that, because I'm actually as far back as I can go. If I go any further back or use a wider lens, the Taj gets smaller. If I use a telephoto, if I use a standard lens, I can't include the arch, I can get the Taj. So it was critical that I had the 18mm lens with me in this particular case. But it's those receding lines that wide angle lenses are so effective at producing. This is a long exposure, obviously, at Uluru, but because the clouds are actually moving directly over my head away from me, or it may be that they were coming towards me. It's impossible to tell from this shot, but certainly towards or away, not across. The lines that the clouds make, because it was shot on an 18mm lens, will always converge towards the middle of the frame. And once you know that, you can use it to your advantage, because that pulls your attention down to the red rock. And I hope you agree. I think it's a fairly strong image. And that's because of the perspective of that lens. Wouldn't work with a 35 or a 50mm lens, because you simply wouldn't have that extent of clouds above you moving, and the exaggeration of the perspective wouldn't be as pronounced. The opposite of this is very, very powerful compression of perspective. And I've got a couple of shots of two different perspectives with the same lens coming up, but this is the Orion, the ship that used to do the cruises around Australia, the Kimberley. This is in New Zealand, and this is Milford Sound, actually. And by using a telephoto lens from a long way away, I've made the mountains loom hugely over the little tiny ship. If you shot this picture with the ship much, much closer with a wide-angle lens, you'd have a big ship and small mountains. So you can play around with perspective by simply changing your angle of view, which is the focal length of your lens, and your position relative to the subject. And the stand off and use a telephoto lens gives you this this compression, and it allows you to eliminate anything you don't want, like the sky, which isn't helping in this case, exaggerates atmospheric conditions like dust in the air and backlight, and also brings those zodiacs very close together, and they look like they're quite close. In actual fact, they're probably a couple of 100 meters apart between the second and the third and the first one. But because it's compressed, it brings them into a better relationship. It's a very, very powerful effect. Wide-angle lenses tend to dilute, and telephoto lenses tend to consolidate and compress things into a really interesting way, and it allows you to control the relationship of your subjects a lot easier. Same with this one. This is just out in central West Australia. I was heading up there to do one of my rodeo pictures for my book, and came across this scene, and it's just he's just sowing seeds, I think. Can't exactly remember, but again, backlight with the dust and telephoto lens, the 280mm straight into the sun after it's gone down, compresses that perspective, eliminates anything that's distracting, and just brings out that silhouette beautifully. And then the last, here we go. So a couple of examples of perspective. These two shots were taken from the same place. And I'm just going to bring up my little pointer. So this is lava flowing into the sea from this volcano. This is Kamchatka Peninsula, or the Kuril Islands. And I'm in a Zodiac, and I'm shooting these guys with a 24mm lens. So there's a Zodiac, 24mm lens, big Zodiac, small mountain. The picture on the left is taken just out of frame where I've got the pointer now, just where the lava finishes. That's the edge of the lava field, and there are some other Zodiacs around the side. And by using a 280mm lens, you can see very clearly how the perspective changes. Now I've got small Zodiacs and large lava field taken from the same place. So it just goes to show how telephoto and wide-angle lenses change the relationship of subjects relative to one another, which is what perspective is, of course. That defines perspective, relationship of things in the frame. This next one is a similar idea. This is Myanmar, and both taken, those figures are more or less the same size in the frame, the fishermen. The left-hand one was taken with the 90 Summicron on the SL from a bit further away, so I have moved. The picture on the right was taken from much, much closer in, with the camera held over the side of my dinghy or my canoe, very close to the water, looking up. And if you look at the distant background, or the hills in the distance, they are the same different distance away in both cases. In the left-hand picture, they seem a lot closer because of the telephoto compression, and in the right-hand picture, they're pushed way, way, way into the distance because I use the 18mm lens. So there is a good example, I think, of how effective that difference of perspective can be when you use the right focal length lens. And that's why you choose them, to get that different distance. I mean, you could shoot everything on a 50mm lens. You'd get a very similar perspective and many people do that. You'd have to move yourself to change the framing and so on, but it doesn't give you those options of playing around with deep perspective. All right, just to recap slightly, and then I'll give you my little recommendations for lens sets. I hope we're still going okay. Broadly speaking, wide-angle lenses make distant objects look further away and exaggerate the size of very close objects, because you have to get close to fill the frame with something, so inevitably it's going to be closer. Standard lenses tend to keep things pretty much even. There's no exaggeration of perspective, and telephoto lenses tend to compress, bring the distant objects forward, and so that things become a similar size in the frame. So using those two tools allows you to play with that. And telephoto lenses, wide-angle lenses are two categories of lens which do more or less the same thing, just to different degrees. So the wider the lens, the more it exaggerates the fall off. The longer the telephoto lens, the more it exaggerates that compression, and also allows you to pick out subjects from further away. All right, now the question I get, so I don't like to put charts on the screen, it's not very exciting, but I just wanted to answer a question I get a lot. So you bought a camera, you bought a lens, what do I get next? And this, just in a nutshell, is what I would suggest. If you're shooting on rangefinder and you get a 50mm lens first, I would probably go next for a 21 or a 28, which you'll find more useful. And then once you've mastered the whole rangefinder thing, go with the telephoto lens. Because on the rangefinders, if you're not using the visor flex on top, those of you who are shooting rangefinder will agree with me, I'm sure. It's really quite tricky to focus the telephoto lenses. The visor flex or the live view on the back makes it a lot easier. So I would tend to go 50, then wide, and then telephoto. If you started with a 35mm lens, I'd go straight to the 21, and I'd go with a 75. Okay? Then just the same thing for the SL. If you were going with zooms, I'd start with the 24-90, then go with the longer lens, because I think you'll find it more useful at first, then go for the super wide, because the zoom, the first zoom includes 24mm, which is pretty wide anyway. Going wider than that is a little bit tricky sometimes, but the telephoto is easier to use. If you were going with fixed, I would go 50, then 28, then 90, or 50 and then 24. And can you see that they're doubling in focal length? That's kind of the idea, is that you generally skip a focal length in the range. So 21 to 35 to 75, and then you've got to have 28 to 50 to 90. That's not a bad way to go. Now, of course, it's entirely up to you. Buy all of them if you like. It's not a problem at all. But if you were just going to do the one lens, second lens, third lens, then that would be my recommendation. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. Good evening for now.